Now, when this alien intelligence shows up that is superhuman, what's life going to be like?
How would you imagine a post-AGI world?
You have to find a way to coexist with this development. When you do something, you want either a quick no or a long-term yes. The startup founders are fighting essentially a validation game, and that whoever emerges among the startups is the one you should buy. Work on the hardest problems you can, because that's where the gains will be. It's so easy for us to criticize, and we love to criticize. Everything's wrong, I could do so much better. You try it. You take on those things.
Do you think we're in an AI bubble?
I do not. I actually think AI is undervalued. It's when the competitor shows up that the game is on.
What do you think the US should do?
I'll be very clear here. China's going to win this race with enormously negative effects unless we get our act together.
Do you think US companies should not use open source models from China?
This is a very good question.
Hi everyone, welcome to the first episode of AI Founder Journey. I'm your host Amir, and today I'm very thrilled to have my friend Eric Schmidt on this episode. Eric was the former CEO of Google, the current CEO of Relativity Space, and a vocal voice about AI and the global race. Today we deep dive into the journey of founding a company, scaling a company, attracting and retaining talent, AI, the global race, and the future of AI. So, hi Eric, it's fantastic to see you again. Congratulations, by the way, on the new role. And to start, how would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, I guess now I'm the former CEO of Google. I'm a KBE for the people who know about these things. And I'm also now the CEO of Relativity Space, a large private company in the rocket industry.
Very nice, very nice. So I want to start by taking your advice and perspective on the startup journey. And as a founder, one of the hardest things is to find talent and hire them. And at some point, when you really find the right talent, this talent ends up going to start their own companies. I was wondering, when you joined Google or Sun Microsystems, were you considering starting your own company?
I don't consider myself, that's a good question, thank you. I don't consider myself a founder. When I met you, I thought, no, this is a founder. So founders sit at home and they have an idea and they become very passionate about it, and they spend all day thinking about it. I'm much more of a professional executive. I work for you or with you to scale and grow the business. And I've always thought that was the correct mode for me. And so first with Sun, that's why I was very young, I learned how to do it. But also with Larry and Sergey, when I met them, it was clear that they were brilliant and that I was not. It was also clear that my experience would help them, and they didn't have that experience. After we did our initial deal in 2001, Larry looked at me and said, we don't need you now, but we're going to need you in the future. And I thought, it's kind of obnoxious, but he was exactly right. He didn't need me now. He got everything right to that point, right, which is a remarkable achievement. But my contribution was scaling. And so I think if you're a founder, your job is to have that special judgment of where the company goes, how to hire people, fighting with the board, all of that. If you're me, your job is to take someone else's idea and make it hugely successful. And in particular, a lot of the founders, I'm not naming any particular one, need help because their skills are fantastic for innovation, but often they don't have the patience to set up boring functions like G&A and legal compliance and all the things that companies have to do. So that's, I think, the difference.
Yeah, and to your point, you had a hugely successful journey as joining these companies early, and a lot of the times, people who end up becoming founders could have had a better journey if they had just joined a promising company. So, can you say a bit more also about this journey? Why is it sometimes better to join not as a founder?
So I thought a lot about this, and the current economic system has produced the most valuable companies in the world by far, in my industry in the last decade in the United States and China. And they all have the following property. They have investors who fund the companies. They have places where the people are incubated. The people are often extremely young, untested, very self-confident, arrogant, whatever you want to call them. And they disagree with something. And then they have this other interesting idea. They have a new insight. Now, the problem with those insights is that often those insights are a product feature, not a platform or a product. In other words, they've come up with a better way of doing X, and X is an important component of this bigger system. Usually, those founders end up getting acquired. There are very, very few ideas that can really grow at that. So there's a natural inefficiency in the market in that those people should have gone to the winning company in the first place. On the other hand, to argue against that point, think of it this way. Why does a company buy a smaller company in the first place? Well, presumably because they need that function. So over and over again, what I've seen is that the startup founders are fighting essentially a validation game, and that whoever emerges among the startups is the one you should buy. And then the rest should be garbage collected. And I mean that people should end up in other roles and so forth. But usually you do what are called acqui-hires in these companies. What you're paying, whatever that price you're paying for the people, which is obviously value, but you're also paying for knowing that they're best in what they do right now, which you don't know when you're a CEO for your normal teams. So what I like about this model is that as long as revenue is going up and as long as valuations are insane, which seems to be most of the time in the winners anyway, which is remarkable.
Yeah.
It allows the company, the big company, to buy a little company. They get the winner, but most importantly, they get the winning people, right? And then the other companies, which is, remember that 9 out of 10 companies don't make it in the way we're discussing. In some cases, it's much worse than that. The traditional number in venture is that 4 go completely out of business and 5 become the living dead, which means they are not growing and you can't get rid of them. And that's, of course, the most uncomfortable. When you do something, you want either a quick no or a long-term yes. You don't want to be stuck in that middle where you can't grow and you can't shrink. And I've seen that in a number of cases.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And to your point, it's all about the team. And I'm curious, you also invest and back founders. What do you look for in a founder before you invest in them?
But let me state that to answer your previous question, the system works so well, I encourage people not to tinker with it, right? There may be some improvements on the edge, but the fact of the matter is, look at the wealth and technology and customers that have been, start with Microsoft and Apple, and then go through Sun and the others in that generation, then go through Google and its generation, and look at Meta, and then look at Airbnb and Tesla and so forth, SpaceX. All of these have the same property, that they entered these competition. Now, when you look for a founder, I'll give you a simple test. You're a founder. At some point, and let's say I'm your investor, which I hope to be, at some point, you're going to be in the situation where a big company has decided to do the same thing as your little company is doing, right? It always happens because they hear about you and they think this is interesting, and they have some extra people or extra resources, and they enter the market. The founder I'm looking for looks at that and says, game on, and then doubles their energy, redoubles their focus on scaling, redoubles and motivates their team against this competitive threat. It's loosey-goosey when you're a startup and everything's going well and you have no challengers and so forth. I've got a couple companies, some of which you know about, they're in that phase of goodness. Their message looks good, the people are coming in and so forth. They don't have a direct competitor. It's when the competitor shows up that the game is on. Right now, you're just having a good time, and the competitors show up so quickly. So to me, that's the essence of leadership. Your ability to rise in a situation, and instead of being cowed, right, having the nerves to lead. The difference between being a CEO, founder CEO or CEO, is that CEOs, and let's just talk about CEOs in general, CEOs get jostled all the time. So I've always thought that CEOs were underappreciated, having been one for so long, because it's very hard to get someone who is willing to put up with all of the terrible stuff that goes on every day. The internal issues, the hiring issues, people are leaving, people are coming, your competitors are trying to manipulate you, the press is after you, the press is generally negative after you're successful. Your customers, of course, are needy, your investors want more. Getting somebody who's willing to work in that environment, in the same sense that our political leaders are subjected to the same amount of abuse, if you will. These are special people, and it's obviously self-serving, but I admire the people who are willing to be in the ring. It's the famous Roosevelt quote about, I admire the men in the arena, 1910 quote. It's easy to be the critic, but the person in the arena is the person I want to be, and I want my founders and my colleagues to be in that arena. It's so easy for us to criticize, and we love to criticize. Everything's wrong, I could do so much better. You try it. You take on those things. Do you have the fortitude to get up every day and for 12 or 14 hours a day, deal with all of this, and then go home and be nice to your family and don't kick the dog, right? It's very hard. It's much harder than people think.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So maybe we can also touch on, like, there's a lot of founders, there's a lot of AI startups out there, and to your point, sometimes joining early a company that is doing well, or like clearly will do well, is a better choice. But given how many AI startups out there, it's very hard for a lot of these engineers looking to join a startup to find which startup they should join. So do you have any advice for them on how they should pick or how evaluate them?
Well, one of the things to understand is that this is a natural consequence of the model you were discussing with me earlier. Every time there's a new wave, there's lots of people trying to be the winner. And so, and especially as a young person coming out of graduate school or whatever, it's very hard to know. And so my view is actually a little different from most people. I don't think you try to pick the winner. I think you try to pick the place where you're going to have the most fun. Because if you're having fun, assuming you're a high quality person, you're working with very smart people. And a rising tide does lift all boats. And I will tell you that there's, an example is, who invented the iPhone? And your answer would be Steve Jobs. No, that's actually not true. There were 1,000 people at Apple with a vice president who was in charge of it, who was very talented. And Steve was a master showman and a brilliant strategist and so forth. But there was a whole team that did all that work. And yet we don't know who they are. So think about the role and history that they've had in our world, and they should be very proud of what they did. So the fact of the matter is, if we go back to this question of how do you want to sort of lead with incredibly smart people, and then as a young person, find the smartest people that you know, and just literally maybe your best friends in graduate school or whatever it is, and hang out with them. And if there's any sense of winning, just try it. And that's the genius of the system. And especially as a young person, you can afford to take risks. The funny thing is, when Larry and Sergey and I were talking about as the company became successful, one day Larry said, I don't understand. When we founded the company, we had nothing and we took these huge risks. Now we have all of this money and we're not taking the same level of risks. And that's the natural course of aging. And he was, of course, right, as usual. And that's the natural course of aging in a company. So especially in startups, it's the time to take the risks, right? And they have so many things against them. If you go back to successful startups, and I know you know this, startups need a bunch of things to happen. They need to be in the right time. The technical term is product market fit. They need to be building something that the market wants. They have to have a new idea that solves a new problem with very good technology, and they have to have a way of monetizing. So if you look at Google, Google had two things. It had the search engine itself, which is obviously brilliant because it was called PageRank. Larry invented it as part of his master's work way back when. But it also had a monetization engine, generally known as AdSense, which used a different kind of auction that was better. It's called a Vickrey auction, where it was a so-called second price auction. And I remember when I discovered this, and again, they invented it, I thought, we have the right combination. We have a great product, and we have a way of monetizing it. I had no idea how successful that would be. When you start, you have no idea because we had no cash. But the brilliance of it was it scaled. Today, just to give a precise answer, when I meet with a startup, and I was doing this today, I would say, show me where the learning is in your model. So if you're building a company that's not learning as it goes, and by that I mean using a foundation model or some other AI tool, you're going to be beaten by the competitor that has learned that, because the fastest learner wins. This produces a very interesting conversation. So the learning people are different from the traditional engineering. And if you don't have any, they're very hard to get. Whereas the companies which are built by the AI founders are typically not engineers who know how to build things. So then you have to augment either one. So the perfect company, in my view today, would have some AI researchers and learning people who can understand how to use machine learning as essentially foundation models, specialized models, fine-tuned models, and so forth to scale. And the reason that that's so interesting is that if you build on something like GCP and the Google Cloud or its competitors, once you get learning going on, as the learning accelerates, your market share accelerates. So learning and fast market share gains tends to get you to a 90% space and therefore dominance in a field, as long as you do it quickly. The fastest path to wealth for a startup founder is to do what I just said, if possible.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, to your point, it's really about the learning process, which is right. But a lot of the times when you're trying to hire people, you interview them, they really want clarity on like, hey, what are you doing exactly? What is the product? Who are you going after? But we're just figuring this out, But what we want to know is how quickly we can get to it.
I think one of the things about recruiting, this is for you and your team, but for everybody watching, is you want to create a form of seduction where you want to state, we have this incredible opportunity and we have a hard problem. The top people are not motivated by money or fame. They're most interested in solving a really hard, fundamental, and new problem. And so when I try to recruit people, I say, look, I don't know what to do here, but if you can solve this problem, right, whatever it is, then you'll be a hero. And that works. I'll give you an example of a young man I've been working with on the military side. And it's very clear, and I won't go into the details for obvious reasons. It's very clear that he is a passionate designer of things. And he's not particularly good at anything else, but he's capable of designing things which are extraordinarily good in the aerospace and in the satellite area. So what do you do with such a person? You let them run, right? You basically say, solve the problems in this space. Let's see what you can come up with. And if they're at all interesting, I'll fund the hell out of it. And it works, right? Because you're appealing to his brilliance, but also to his vanity, right? So one way to understand the psychology is that a CEO's job is to get other people to do exceptional work. And the CEO's job is to orchestrate that. Now, CEOs, people forget that 30 or 40 years ago, CEOs were largely hated and thought to be uninteresting. And then we went through this period where everyone loved every tech CEO. And now we're going back to this thing where everyone's under attack all the time for many good reasons. But during the heyday, when we were so popular, it was like amazing. People understood that our job was to essentially organize creative people so that they could be successful. If they're successful, then I am successful. So think of it as if this guy is successful, then I will be successful. And if I'm successful, then the financials will work and everyone wins. People get confused. They think that this is about money, which there's obviously a lot of it, and credit to the people who make that happen. Money is the least important. What is important is being successful in terms of changing the world. What I've learned about people is if you can motivate them around a mission, it's so much easier to manage them because they're busy. I don't need to worry about them. I don't need to worry about these people. I know they're busy because they actually care. And what would happen, I'll give you an example. At Google in the early years, people would come to me and they would say, because you're asking about this, they'd say, well, I'd really like to work for you. I said, okay, well, that'd be great. I like you too. And he goes, but this person goes, but I'm a vice president now. My next job is CEO. So I have to be a COO, excuse me, which is the number 2 position. And I would say to them very nicely, we don't have a structure for a COO now, but we have a lot of hard problems. That turned out to be the decider. So there are 3 or 4 people who I personally liked who gave the wrong answer, and they would have made, I don't know, $1 billion had they just said, large numbers. Had they just said, I want to come here and I want to just work on the hardest problem you're facing. Because there's lots of hard problems. And people get confused as to what the priority is. If you work for me, as important as you are as a human, you have to say, I'm going to do whatever it takes to make the company successful. And in small companies, because there's this large amount of white space, you can occupy any spaces you want. So what I want you as my employee is to go occupy all these different spaces and sort them out and tell me where there's a problem, because you're smarter than I am in this stuff. That's how it really works. In one of my books, in How Google Works, we talk about the distinction between divas and knaves. A diva is Steve Jobs. Brilliant, irascible, committed. No one ever questions Steve's commitment to his customers and to Apple and to the success of his firm. A knave is someone who is in a similar position, but they're fundamentally self-dealing. They're just optimizing for themselves. So if you remember that division, diva versus knave, and it's hard sometimes to tell, keep the divas, support them, because they're the ones that change the company. They're the ones that deliver these new products, but you have to listen to them. Whereas the knaves, frankly, you just have to fire them. And I'm sorry to say, but if their intrinsic nature is around themselves, and if they're not fundamentally going to rise to the cause and to the occasion and to the majesty of the power that they have, then it's not going to work. When I was at Google, every day I said to myself, I'm so fortunate to be able to lead this company and to play this role because of the consequences. And I never forgot that I was hired by the founders, and even though they nominally worked for me, in practice we worked as a team because I respected their contribution and they certainly respected mine.
Yeah. Where do you find the divas? How do you find it? Where?
They show up, and they show up if there's something interesting. We've tried lots of different paths. Usually the divas are leading a technology effort, again, these are technology comments, in another company, and they're dissatisfied because they're not being treated and listened to, or they're somebody who's coming out of a university who's unusually broadly talented. A lot of university people are very narrow, of course, but there are people who cross that boundary. Sometimes they emerge out of your own employee base. What I've learned with organizations is don't call the question of somebody's success until they actually get tested. So especially with software, most people who are not software people cannot figure out what the software people are doing. And the software people in general cannot figure out what they're doing. It's not like hardware. It's something you're an expert in. And it's very hard to know if this team can pull it off. And so giving them a short-term task, which is hard, and seeing how they organize it. Another way of saying this is with an engineering executive, my rule was I should be able to just walk up with them in the hallway, unprepared, and they should be able to answer the following questions. What are you doing? What are your problems? What's your schedule? And how do I get faster? And stop complaining about not having enough resources. Nobody has enough resources, right? That little litany that I just gave you was a pretty good test of whether the people were paying attention or out to lunch. It's very easy as a manager or executive to surf. I do this all day. Oh, yeah, you told me that, so now I'm an expert. Oh, Amir, you're smart. You explained this to me. I'm an expert. That's surfing, right? You need to, as a CEO, you really need to understand the details well enough to master them well enough to lead. And that starts with understanding what the people are doing and learning how to listen to them and pay attention and make minor corrections. And that's what I try to do in everything I do.
Yeah. And it's obviously very, very hard. I think until you have experienced it yourself, I don't think people realize how hard it is. And I'm sure It's been a very interesting and a rewarding journey for you.
A- And by the way, I don't, anybody listening to this would say, what a piece of crap. Sorry. These people are highly paid. They get all sorts of attention and so forth. All of that is true. But it's important to remember that these are human beings with real lives, real families, and so forth. And so trying to understand them in a human context will allow you to understand them better, to be one or to work for one. So I had the benefit of mentors. When I first went to Sun, there was a guy named Bernie, who's retired now, who's absolutely brilliant. And he was just ruthless on me. Why are you late? Why? And I kept, well, why do we care? I didn't really know as an academic. And he taught me the precision of management, right? So I am here talking to you today because people took a bet on me. They saw whatever raw potential and they figured out he's deficient here. So at my age, I want to take the same bets. But in order to do that, I need people who will listen to the feedback. And it's fine if they argue, but they have to be able to internalize it. One of the things that you can look in political systems is the political systems that they get sort of cocksawed in the wrong way, whatever the correct term is. And if they listen, they correct. But if they're ideologues, they don't correct. So the problem with ideologues is that they can be very wrong long enough that you can go bankrupt by convincing yourself right. So a CEO spends a correct CEO spends all their time nervous that what they're being told is not the full picture. So I always made a point of trying to ask everyone I knew about any particular problem, and I would always listen for a discordant view. And then the discordant view, I would try to figure out, are they just unhappy? Which is certainly possible. But in companies, you end up with dogmas that are set in the company, but not true in life. The most obvious one is the media industry, which had these large distribution companies, all of which are being disintermediated by online and social media and all that kind of stuff. For the 15 years I worked with them, I came to a conclusion that because the people had contracts that said this is what they have to deliver, that the change would not occur in the company until the contract had ended, and then a next and, shall we say, younger, newer point of view would show up as the CEO. And that was a pretty good predictor of what would happen. So part of this is also generational shifts. So when you see a company that's been run the same way forever, it's time to think about how do you buy it and restructure it. Most people can't do that. Or build a competitor. I'll give you another example. If you look at the sort of database industry, it has been ripe for a long time for a purely online database SQL solution to appear. Hasn't shown up for various reasons. In your industry, in semiconductors, you and I have spoken about how there's an opportunity to disrupt the design tools, which are again aging, with a new idea, or the companies can adopt these new ideas, but that's usually very hard. One of the things to understand is, why do these opportunities keep coming up? I mean, after all, we're talking about it, the history here, there's lots of books written about it. And partly it's because an existing company gets locked into a set of interlocking agreements with itself. How do they make money? How do they treat their customers? How do they build products? What the pressure on the system is. Usually the only way such a company can change is if the founder, not the CEO, but the founder comes in and pushes the hammer. Usually it takes either a major calamity like bankruptcy or something huge like that, or a bad ruling or something, to force a change culturally. Humans like to continue working on whatever they're working on at the pace they have been. Part of the job of being a CEO is to understand this and to understand where to put the pressure. And there's a certain amount of physical limits that we all have.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about where all this talent is trying to go. Obviously, AI. Do you think we're in an AI bubble?
I do not. I actually think AI is undervalued, underappreciated, not overappreciated. Dario Amodei made an argument that I'll summarize a couple months ago, that the AI industry is governed by scaling laws. And the first scaling law is the scaling law involving deep learning, where if you add more essentially hardware, networking, and so forth, you get these discoveries. The scaling law is what brought us ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude 3, and there's more room to go there. We have not found the limit of that scaling law. There are two more coming. One is involving reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning is where you go forward and back, and you sort of come up with plans. So think of it as planning. And the best examples here would be OpenAI O3 and DeepSeek R1. There's a couple more coming. And they do it remarkably well. They're quite shocking when you look at them. And the third is called test time compute. And what happens there is the model is learning as it's going. It's just at its infancy. So until we see those arcs begin to slow, and it's easy to say they'll slow in 6 months, but nobody knows. And they've not slowed yet. Now we may run out of important things like electricity, right? So there's some real physical limits coming. But if you look at, for example, the NVIDIA announcements recently of the GB300, it's just extraordinary. The AMD product, the 350 that they just launched is, again, you understand this better than I, is extraordinarily good. Trainium is very good. The new TPU, I think it's the 5D chip out of Google, similarly optimized. There's still a lot of room for hardware improvements and software improvements for AI to begin to help us with business process and reasoning and invention. And I'm not even talking about the discoveries in science, which are profound, AlphaFold, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, let's say we get to a point where all this progress has been made. How would you imagine a post-AGI world would look like?
Well, I wrote a book about this called Genesis, which you have a copy of. And it came out in November with Kissinger and Craig Mundie. It was the last project of Henry before he died, and he finished the book a week before he died. So it's a very emotional and special thing from my perspective as my close friend. And in the book, we talk a lot about what is it like to have all of this stuff around you, to human identity. So he says it more beautifully than I do, but the way to understand it is that we have a whole bunch of unwritten and unspoken assumptions about what it means to be human. We understand that we have consciousness, although we cannot define it. We understand human excellence. We celebrate the great athletes, the great car drivers, and all that kind of stuff, the great mathematicians. So as humans, now when this alien intelligence shows up that is superhuman, what's life going to be like? Now, I'll give you the thought experiment. There's something which I call the San Francisco School. And it says that the people from San Francisco are literally claiming that we're going to get to human intelligence level within 3 to 4 years. This is called AGI. And when they define it, they say the best human. The thing after that is super intelligence, where you have the best of all humans. In other words, you're smarter than the sum of all humans. So let's imagine that you and I are in charge of a system which is smarter than all humans. Just think about that. And let's assume that it's, trillions of dollars and lots of computers and and you and I are running it. How would you manage it? What would you allow it to work on? Well, if it falls into the wrong hands, it could figure out things which would kill us all. That's obviously not good. How would you organize it to make sure that people are not losing their freedom? The simple example would be that humans don't like to be told by computers what to do. So let's say that I'm in New York and the computer has organized the traffic patterns so that it's optimal. But for some reason, the optimal solution hurts me in my neighborhood. Or another example is that a woman who's pregnant and about to give birth, and her husband, or whatever stereotype you wish, is going to drive her to the hospital, but the car won't go fast enough to get her to the hospital to save the baby. That's clearly not okay, right? You can think of a million such examples, the interactions with children. The book explores all of these. What I would tell you is we don't have a system of thinking in our current language about what it's like to live with such intelligences. And they are coming. Our predictions may be wrong, but we've generally been directionally correct, although occasionally our timing is off.
Now that I think about what you just described, if it's really smarter than us, then what is our role basically there? They're fully autonomous, or they can
No, but I'll give
Yeah.
well, does that mean that we're the dogs to them as humans? In other words, does the computer take pity on us because it's smarter than we are? It's obviously not good. So we have to find a way as a society, and this is more than you and me in the tech industry. We have to find a way to coexist with this development, which is extraordinarily important because the development of this intelligence would allow us to solve climate change, life extension, diseases that have bedeviled humans for 1,000 years or more. All the tough parts about human life could be really changed in a really fundamental way by this tool if it's applied correctly.
Yeah, this is it's really inspiring, and also, sometimes I start thinking like this is so important, and why aren't all these countries just funneling all their tax money and effort into like AI and like trying to see how farther we can push? Do you think that there should be more investment in AI and more focus on AI in general that is currently not being done?
Well, China is doing exactly what you said. As a result of the incredible success of DeepSeek, the Chinese government, which has largely been asleep on this, has decided this is another national priority. They're pouring billions of dollars into this. And the Chinese model is to be taken very seriously. They're very smart. They work really hard. And although they don't have the advantage of some of the chips we have, the constraints that we put them under cause them to invent new algorithms, such as what you see in DeepSeek, which are impressive. So never underestimate the Chinese competition here. So for people who don't really care about everything else I've said, China is going to win. I'll be very clear here. China is going to win this race with enormously negative effects unless we get our act together. Now, the American model is roughly the following. Universities do the research, venture capitalists take the risk, government sets the rules. We need more help in all of those areas. Because of some of the changes in the government right now, universities are having terrible economic times. So here's an example, you know this well. A number of computer scientists who are graduating from graduate school, these are the most valuable people in the world, they don't want to go to industry. They want to go and become a professor, but they can't get an interview to even interview with these universities because they're on a hiring freeze. And that will set those efforts and research back. Now they'll be gobbled up in a sec in industry, but then they won't come back. In the case of venture, I think the venture industry in the US is doing pretty well because the financial markets are so deep. President Trump has indicated that he's not going to pursue, in fact, he's canceled many of the Biden AI initiatives. The new team is getting confirmed. And my sense is that they'll be focused on the China threat, which is a legitimate one. And what I hope they do is they come back with a statement that, which I did when I did the National Security Commission on AI a few years ago, is that it's imperative that the winner in AI win using American values and not Chinese values. The American traditionally liberal values of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, if you were to put China in charge of those values would not be front and center. They would be forgotten or omitted.
Yeah, well, I cannot agree more. The DeepSeek model is definitely one of the leading open source models that's definitely that China is winning, at least on the open source front. I would love to hear from you. What do you think the US should do to move faster? And should we be doing even more open source or closed source? What is your perspective on that?
So we're in a very strange conundrum. All of us, and in particular me, grew up in the open source movement. Open source, for the viewer's background, is where the software and the data are released so that everybody can use it. And it doesn't make any sense that you would invent something and give it away. But in fact, by inventing something and giving it away in traditional markets, the really smart people want to come work with you and you stay ahead using this novel technique of giving your competitors your information. I know it sounds weird, but it works really, really well. Google can be understood as an open source company in the sense that much of the underlying technology at Google was based on open source, although there's proprietary components. Apple is the inverse. Apple is essentially a closed source company, famously because Steve, that's the way he wanted it. I talked to him a lot about this, but it has open source components, which it licenses or gives away for a reason. So there's variations in the models. So in the case of AI, the current leading models, the top ones are all closed, which means you don't understand what they're doing. You have API access, or you can ask them an English question or what have you. Their meta is what is called closed source open weights. So they release the weights, which is good for the ecosystem. And but it also allows people like China to use those models. It's very hard to use the leading models. So that's sort of the tension that's been set up. If you look, we need more open source innovation in the universities because that's where the original ideas come from. So even if you accept that the top companies will be proprietary, and by the way, that's largely because of money. These models cost $100 to $200 million. You're going to spend $200 million on a model and then give it away? Are you an idiot? And so getting through that, even they would agree that you need more open source innovation in the universities for the new things. I mentioned reinforcement learning. I'm familiar with a new effort at one university that has a different way of doing foundation models using a different kind of math. This is welcome competition. The more open source initiatives we can get globally, there's lots of smart people and the stakes are huge. Why don't we try that? So we need to help them. And the issue is going to be proliferation. I'll explain the technical problem. We estimate roughly 10 to the 26, that's one with 26 zeros behind it, floating point operations, which is a measure of computation, is the point at which the models can develop essentially dangerous knowledge. When they're small, they don't really know very much, but as they get deeper and deeper into a subject, they appear to be able to know things that are maybe bad. The most obvious ones are bombs and bad viruses and things like this. And so coming up with a way of policing the open source models, which remember, you're giving the source code away, while keeping us safe is what we call a wicked hard problem. We don't have a good solution for that yet. We're working on it.
Were you surprised when like DeepSeek open sourced a frontier model that was relatively better than most of the other open source, if not all of them? Was that surprising to you? Like, why would they do that? Why, if we're in a competition in a way?
As usual, I was completely surprised because I had discounted them incorrectly. And DeepSeek had been around for a while. They started off, by the way, as a financial hedge fund. They're not a tech company. And indeed, they're self-funded. They made a lot of money in the Chinese market, et cetera. But they're obviously brilliant. And they're a good example where they used the Llama model, which is open source. And there's some claims that they did distillation of closed models where you listen to their answers, which is a violation of terms of service, which wouldn't surprise me. But the fact of the matter is that they managed using all the hardware constraints to do something which was near the quality of the people without them, which is something to take advantage of. If you look at DeepSeek, some of their claims are not correct. They claim that it cost $5 million to train the model, but in fact, they used a model that cost more than $100 million to train the model. So that's an omission. So we will see. What is interesting to me, now that I understand it, is that China appears to be on a path to open source everything in response to our having the leadership closed. This has a very important implication. Most countries do not have access to the top stuff, but they're desperate. So they'll end up on top of Chinese open source models. Cannot be good for us. We need alternatives to the open source version of what China is doing in order to remain ahead.
Yeah, indeed they do not mention what was the cost of the total training, but I think they do mention in the paper that this was the cost of the last runs or something like that. But to your point, they have already reserved a lot of GPUs that they're using, and this is just based on the hourly rates that calculated for the last iteration. But for sure, it took multiple iterations. Even you can go back to the open source models that they built on top. So it definitely costs way more than that.
Let me give you another example of this problem. So one of the questions I don't know the answer to is, can you get into a situation where you have too much power in your data centers for the money that you can make? So if you look at markets over time, directionally it's correct, but sometimes they can get ahead of it. In other words, you can have too much of something and not enough of another. The simple answer is that there's not enough revenue in the system today to justify all the capital spending. Now, if that's true, then these huge data centers that are getting planned will end up being economic craters. I don't happen to agree with this, but you see the caution, because this is not like what I normally do, which is you hire 10 people, have a good time. We're talking about $50 billion, $100 billion of capital investment. These are business people who will want their capital returned. So we have to come up with a sort of an understanding of what is the real demand rate going to be in this space. What DeepSeek shows you is that you can get near the optimal with much fewer resources. Give them credit for that. On the other hand, when you look at RL and the various forms of planning, they use, 100 times more essentially flops or tokenization or what have you, because they're going back and forth in their reasoning, which the current models are not doing. So I'm going to vote personally that we are not going to have enough hardware for the next 10 years. And ultimately, the limit will be electricity and the ability to build those systems. They take forever. But I don't know. You're a semiconductor expert. One of the core questions, the semiconductor industry goes from boom to bust. They make a beautiful product, which they overcharge on because they have to recoup their R&D. Eventually, they can make so many that product, which is so beautifully done, the price falls to almost zero because there's demand for the next one now. And so it's this natural boom-bust cycle in the semiconductor industry, which is quite ruinous historically. We haven't gone through that cycle yet. I'm sure we will at some point.
To your point in the semiconductor industry, do you think that the CHIPS Act was helpful? And it doesn't seem like it has achieved the goals it wanted to, or slowed down China. What's your take?
I don't agree with you on that. Sorry to say. I was a strong supporter of the CHIPS Act because it's really simple. About 25 years ago, America, for whatever reason, decided to let all the other countries develop our chips. It first moved, I think, to Singapore and Japan, and now, of course, Taiwan is the hardware island of the world, and they do a fantastic job. There are all sorts of geopolitical issues. So if you want to have control over your supply chain, you're going to have to invest. And there are many reasons why America should have some semiconductor leading firms, the most obvious one being TSMC is doing a large plant in Arizona. They told me that it cost them 4 times as much and took twice as long as in Taiwan, and that's not a surprise. But nevertheless, they are beneficiaries of the CHIPS Act, as is Intel, who's trying to do domestic manufacturing. There are many research efforts, including things you've worked on, where the research is dependent upon the CHIPS Act. So here's a strong statement that the CHIPS Act was intended to bring these capabilities onshore, and I think it's working. It takes time. Semiconductors are really hard.
And maybe one last question. Do you think US companies should not use open source models from China?
Well, this is a very good question. It was funny that I have a number of companies where we have brilliant Chinese researchers and developers, and it never occurred to me that they would use a Chinese model in an American company. And I discovered that they all use them because they're better at this particular function. And so at the moment, my feeling is let the Chinese people, this obviously, the comments are all in Chinese, God knows what it's really doing. Trust them to tell you the truth, but also verify that these things really are what they say they are. For example, I know a number of companies which are using DeepSeek simply because it's quicker in certain things. Now, that's great. My guess is they'll move to the American versions after the American people learn the inventions of DeepSeek. Remember, the cost of token delivery is going down by a factor of 10 a year. And indeed, the cost of serving the results of DeepSeek, it's actually cheaper to do the same thing on Gemini, although the DeepSeek people were quite careful not to point that out.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe one quick last question for our listeners. If you were to go back in time, or you you're like in your 20s and entrepreneur in AI, is there some like very creative idea or like some uh, creative startup that you have in mind or you would start?
Well, when I was that age, I worked on operating systems and programming languages, which shows you how old I am. But they were the systems of the time, getting operating systems to scale, and the computers were impossibly slow and so forth. Disk latency and memory scheduling and all those kinds of things. And I loved it. I did my PhD at Xerox PARC, where a lot of these information, and Berkeley, of course, where a lot of this stuff was invented. And I felt like I was at the center of the world. If I were the same age today, I'd want to be in the center of the world that is most interesting in systems, which in my view is this area of reinforcement learning and improvement, the so-called agentic revolution. We accept deep learning, which was sort of last year's story, is successful. The hardest problems are going to try to keep this planning thing under some level of control, because you can imagine that as you add more steps and as you add more complexity, the demand goes exponential, because you keep trying different things and you eventually figure it out. So the algorithms, and what I've been told by scientists I respect, that the gains in RL in the next few years are going to be profound. And that is huge. That tells me that when you get this stuff at scale, we'll be able to apply planning and reasoning at superhuman capabilities quickly. That is the sexiest thing I can think of to work on, because it's the foundation of everything else. So business processes, essentially step A, step B, step C, underlies everything in what we do in universities, in governments, in business, in the arts, everywhere. Solve that problem. It's interesting. If I were more of a scientist in some of these other areas, like in biology or chemistry or physics, I would probably answer that building foundation models in each of those fields is a fantastic task. So when I meet somebody who's a real scientist in those areas, whereas I'm just a dilettante, I always tell them, why don't you come up with a foundation model that encapsulates the knowledge that you have and then use it at the most powerful way you can? And my experience is that turns on a light bulb, and all of a sudden they say, oh, I can reconceptualize my problem of putting the learning that exists into a computer and having it help me solve the problem. So those, to me, that's another one that's interesting, and that's applicable across pretty much everything. Another example, I was in a political meeting and somebody had a lot of data about voters and their preferences. And I said, why don't you build a foundation model that has all that information in it so we can ask you questions, right? I said, oh, okay. I'll go think about that. So the idea of having this trusted partner in anything you do is, I think, the next really interesting power play, in the sense of, and by power play, I mean impact. What did I do today? When you go home to your family and you say, I had a good day, what's a good day? It's where you solve new problems in these areas using these new tools.
Yeah. Yeah, I worked on reinforcement learning during my PhD at Berkeley for code optimization. And one of the main challenges, honestly, with reinforcement learning is defining a reward function. And it's very hard to precisely describe how the reward model of a human is. And I feel like this is also another area that if we can clearly define what is the reward function to train these models, and with the scale that we have today, back then very few people were talking about reinforcement learning, but now a lot of people are talking more about it. But I feel still there are gaps in really figuring out like these reward models and how to really structure the rules for when the learning improves.
I agree with that. And that's an example of why it's such a hard problem. And as a young person, just to be very clear, work on the hardest problems you can, because that's where the gains will be. Don't do the easy stuff. Somebody else can take care of that. Work on the ones that are really challenging. If you work on really challenging problems and you make progress, you will win in the most important battle, which is your own relevance. When I get up in the morning, why do I matter?
Yes, Eric, this is a really good ending for our podcast. Really, thank you for having the time to chat with us. It was super helpful. You've been very generous with your time. It's great to have you. Great to see you again.
Well, you're a very good friend, and in this new company, you're going to be hugely successful. And I just can't wait to make lots of money because of your success. How's that?
Thank you very much. Really
Okay.
appreciate it, your support. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in. Stay hungry, stay curious. I'm your host, Amir, reminding you to keep experimenting, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible with AI. See you next time on AI Founder Journey.